Such reflections not only highlight the complexities of his grandiose self-structure, but also invite us to consider how these aspirations manifest in relationships and the impact they have on his capacity to really be present when in a relationship. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Pathological narcissism, particularly in the context of relationships, presents complex challenges that stem from the individual's fluctuating traits. These traits often reflect deeper psychological structures, with grandiosity playing a central role. Understanding how the grandiose sense of self impacts behavior and relationships is key to addressing or relating to someone with this disorder. So, what exactly is narcissism, or more specifically, what I just called pathological narcissism? What words come to mind as you try to describe it? Individuals with pathological narcissism may present with an array of varied and sometimes incongruent symptoms. This part is not emphasized enough, but I want to make sure that you understand that these individuals may show a range of dissimilar characterological features, from grandiose to vulnerable, self-aggrandizing to self-effacing, and from socially dominant to socially withdrawn. So yes, all of this is part of the grandiose structure. They could be self-defeating, anxious, and experience depressive-like symptoms due to an excessively self-critical and harsh superego. On a more severe level of disturbance, these individuals can also be callous, dishonest, aggressive, and even antisocial. This is typically referred to as the malignant type of narcissism. According to object relations theory, pathological narcissism encompasses patients who function at different levels of personality organization. That's neurotic, borderline, and psychotic. So in other words, within narcissism itself, as I just mentioned, it varies, right? But there's also different levels of functioning, all the way from, an executive or CEO to somebody who is, holed up in their room and they can't get out. So depending on the level of organization, the extent to which they can tolerate separation, loss, grief, guilt, and mourning, all of this will vary, as will their capacity for empathy, ability to tolerate criticism or constructive feedback, and need for admiration, validation, and attention from others. Despite this variability, one unifying element, and this is what I really want to emphasize in this episode, because this cuts across all cases and all types of pathological narcissism, is the pathological grandiose self-structure. What is this grandiose self-structure? And how might understanding this core narcissistic characteristic change the way we think about and approach the topic of narcissism? The grandiose sense of self is a core feature of narcissism, characterized in part, this is just in part, because remember I said there's a lot of variability, but it's characterized by an inflated self-image and an exaggerated sense of one's abilities and achievements. Now, whether that's there for all, that cuts across all types of narcissism. Whether it's overt or covert is a whole different story. But it significantly impacts the way individuals with this disorder perceive themselves and how they interact with others. Renowned psychoanalyst Herbert Rosenfeld describes the grandiose self as emerging from a fixation on perceived superiority exerting a controlling influence over the personality. I know you probably never thought about it this way before, but yes, what I'm saying is this grandiose structure takes over the more vulnerable part of the self. And I'll explain that as we go along. This structure promises, but these are like false promises, power, perfection, and omnipotence, distorting the individual's perception of reality. In relationships, the effects can be damaging. In a prior episode, I discussed one case of an individual who became trapped in a real estate scam, drawn in by the promise of wealth. That's the false promise. Despite warnings from family members, the distorted reality created by the grandiose self was so strong that he could not see the truth. This case illustrates the profound impact of the grandiose structure, the grandiose sense of self, as individuals caught in its grip are often compelled to chase fantasies, jeopardizing not just his life savings, but meaningful connections with those around him. If you heard that episode, you might remember family members were telling him that he was being scammed, but he completely dismissed them and their concerns. Okay, so now you may be wondering, who's vulnerable to being seduced by this pathological grandiose structure? Clinical research has consistently demonstrated that individuals who exhibit grandiosity often do so as a defense mechanism against a deeper struggle with low self-esteem. These grandiose traits, compensatory in nature, serve as a shield against feelings of profound worthlessness, powerlessness, inadequacy, and unbearable shame, just to name a few. Essentially, these individuals develop certain characteristics or engage in specific behaviors in an attempt to counterbalance those painful emotions. So the more one needs to escape these painful feelings, past childhood trauma, or profound feelings of emptiness, the stronger and more convincing this organization becomes, and therefore the less they are in touch with reality. They begin to live what is known as a lie, actively deceiving others and leading a false life. To borrow a phrase coined by British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, this is known as the false self. Thus, if a person is able to adequately delude themselves and others of, let's say for instance, their greatness, specialness, or kindness, they exist in a world of their own, detached from reality. I'll say more about the false self momentarily.
Have you ever thought what it would be like to be a cop? Well, not just any cop, a Texas cop. Well, we have the show for you. TMPA's Blue Grit Podcast, the voice of Texas law enforcement, where we share intense stories, yes, the good ones and the bad ones. We also share information and have good discussions about how we can improve this profession. So what are you waiting for? Grab that gun belt and come ride shotgun with us today. Available on YouTube and where you get your podcast.
If left unchecked and unchallenged, slowly over time, the grandiose sense of self emerges as a psychological structure. That just means it becomes part of the personality, hence personality disorder. It becomes part of who we are, and it becomes built upon the adoration of perceived superiority. In other words, the person's self-worth or identity is rooted in being seen as better than others. And they believe this, and they thrive on this recognition, whether real or imagined, most of the time imagined, of course. Many renowned psychoanalysts have extensively discussed the grandiose self, particularly how it represents a distorted perception of superiority and invulnerability. In this framework, the individual often merges what's known as their ideal self with an idealized other, forming a blissful but fragile psychological union. And I spoke about this in much more detail in a number of episodes that I did on trauma bonding, because the trauma bond is a perfect example of that magical union. This merger carries the false promise of salvation. And when it's inevitably disrupted, because of course it will be, the individual faces the punitive wrath of a critical, perverse superego. In other words, they beat themselves up. They call themselves names. The grandiose structure, while offering the illusion of perfection, greatness, and superiority, ultimately leads to deeper psychological turmoil when the fragile ideal image shatters, which of course is inevitable because there's no ideal self or ideal other. Before we transition into case material and explore its clinical manifestations, what personal experiences and insights do you have regarding the pathological grandiose self-structure? In some way, does it complicate your relationships? Let's shift our focus to a clinical case so I could try to give a few practical examples of how the grandiose sense of self presents itself. This will allow us to delve into the lived experience of, for example, a man who came to treatment because he was struggling to maintain his narcissistic, grandiose sense of self. If you're interested in doing a deeper dive into the details of this case and other cases that I present as well, I encourage you to check out my educational course for a more in-depth analysis. Quick disclaimer alert, as always, when presenting clinical material, in order to protect the anonymity of my practice and patients, I weave together a composite case, an amalgamation of diverse cases, in other words. However, this narrative represents an authentic story, along with my actual interventions. Okay, let's talk about Barry. Barry was a man who began twice weekly treatment with me when he could no longer maintain his illusion of perfection and greatness. He was a charismatic leader. So remember earlier I mentioned they function at all different levels. And that other material that I just mentioned, I have different levels of functioning. I mean, different cases for each level of functioning, all the way down to what I mentioned earlier, a woman who was, living at home with her mother. Anyway, so this fellow, Barry, was serving as both chief of medicine of the orthopedic department at a major institution, and he was the CEO. But the institute was facing financial collapse, and that's when he came in to see me. He projected an inflated sense of self-importance and envisioned the hospital, not just as a hospital, but as a revolutionary global community, which he described. And this attracted significant investor interest. So people were putting money into his vision. As I delved deeper into Barry's inner world, I began to appreciate the intensity of what I mentioned earlier as the fake promises that appeal to his deepest desires. The primary force at play here was propaganda. Barry had an unwavering conviction that he could attain divine power through money, popularity, and fame. And when I say conviction, this means that this fellow was, far removed in his beliefs from reality. He often referred to himself as God, or as having godlike power. And I quote that, godlike power. The allure of triumphant victory was compelling for him, promising that achieving this state would fulfill all his needs and garner love and admiration. And I quote again, the perfect body, perfect health, and the ability to snack late into the night on endless amounts of junk food. And you can imagine, this could also be late into the night with drink or smoking weed or getting with prostitutes. Because of the grandiose structure, all of this was possible without any consequences, of course, because that's part of the grandiosity. So there are no consequences, there are no repercussions until, of course, he was faced with the reality in this particular situation of high cholesterol and high blood pressure. In other situations, these patients come to me when they're caught cheating. If they're in a marriage or in a relationship and they're caught cheating or they're caught with these prostitutes. In terms of technique, it's crucial to deeply appreciate the patient's subjective experience, particularly regarding their maladaptive, grandiose sense of self-structure. The initial goal is to explore and comprehend this structure, assisting Barry in articulating its workings and underlying beliefs. This process is not solely about therapeutic technique. It also has significant implications for anyone, any of you, who may identify with these traits or find themselves in relationships with someone exhibiting these traits. For those grappling with similar tendencies, recognizing the signs of a grandiose self can be transformative. Understanding how these traits manifest can facilitate self-reflection and encourage healthier patterns of interactions. It allows individuals to confront their insecurities, and I'm going to demonstrate this, and also how it helps navigates the complexities of their self-image, promoting personal growth. Moreover, if you are in a relationship with someone displaying these characteristics, awareness of the grandiose self-structure can enhance your ability to connect with them on a deeper level. By understanding the complexities behind their behavior, you can approach the relationship with greater empathy, enabling you to engage in meaningful conversations that resonate with their underlying vulnerabilities, not with their grandiosity, but you're talking to them at the level of their vulnerabilities. And you know what their vulnerabilities are because you're listening to this episode, but also you know that the vulnerabilities are there because you see the grandiosity, and you know the grandiosity is a defense against these vulnerabilities, if that makes sense. Okay, so here's an example of how I express appreciation. And I quote, "I think I'm getting closer to being great." That's Barry, by the way. That wasn't me. That's what he said. And when he says things, or patients say things like this, and they reference, this is self-reference of greatness, I might ask, can you tell me about that? See, this question opens the door for exploration. What does that look like for you? What do you see? And how do you imagine others will perceive you when you feel great or like God? These inquiries are not just therapeutic. They invite the individual to reflect on their identity and how it shapes their interactions. Over time, our discussions, that's with Barry, revealed his belief that he should never be weak or depend on anyone. And I quote again, "I don't have to rely on you. I can think through all my problems myself. I'm not affected by the same issues as everyone else. I can analyze my feelings away. I can manage everything efficiently and never feel frustrated." End quote right there. That was all from Barry. And this is what you start to hear when you get closer to this grandiose structure. His aspirations were rooted, and I was now able to show him and talk to him about this, in a desire to transcend all pain and frustration. I talked to him about how he should never have to experience painful feelings. And that resonated deeply with him, as he quickly added that, and I quote, "I want to be like Buddha, free from anxiety. Once I get rich, I won't need to work again. Everyone will take care of me." End of quote. This longing raises poignant questions. Is this the vision of the ideal self, blissfully merged with the ideal other, who caters to his every need? Such reflections not only highlight the complexities of his grandiose self-structure, but also invite us to consider how these aspirations manifest in relationships and the impact they have on his capacity to really be present when in a relationship. Ultimately, understanding these dynamics can be crucial for anyone experiencing these wishes, to be taken care of, to achieve greatness, this divine state, right? Or it can be helpful for anyone involved with individuals exhibiting these traits, as it sheds light on the underlying vulnerabilities that drive their behaviors and reveals the potential for deeper, more authentic connections. These connections are vital because earlier we discussed the notion, remember before I said, I borrowed from Winnicott and I said the false self, which serves as a protective facade that individuals with a grandiose self-structure often adopt to do what? To shield against their vulnerabilities. Can you think of moments where you or someone you know may have hidden behind a false self? I ask this question because I've found that by recognizing and addressing the false self, we can help individuals navigate the delicate interplay between their grandiose aspirations and their deeper insecurities. This understanding fosters authentic relationships. And again, that's the ultimate goal. So if you heard me repeat the word authentic a few times, it's because we're trying to get past the false, grandiose structure, which is not easy because it's a structure and part of one's personality, but we're trying to get the more authentic sense of self to emerge. And this way, both parties in a relationship then can explore the complexity of their identities and work towards, again, genuine emotional intimacy. Okay, let's begin wrapping this up by way of review because we covered a lot of ground. In this episode, we delved into the intricacies of narcissism. I called it pathological narcissism, particularly its manifestation in relationships through the lens of the pathological grandiose self-structure. We explored how this inflated self-image is not just a hallmark of narcissism, but a complex defense mechanism deeply rooted in low self-esteem and painful emotions. But I did not say much about childhood trauma. I mentioned that earlier. And that leads to, if we think about it, the childhood trauma leads to the development of the false self or the grandiose structure. And what happens in childhood is complicated. So I'm going to save that for the next episode because there are many different theories in terms of what happens in childhood. But the one similarity is the outcome of, again, this one trait that cuts across all different levels and types of narcissism, which is the grandiose structure. By examining the psychological profiles of someone like Barry, I tried to illustrate how grandiosity can create a deceptive reality that ultimately jeopardizes meaningful connections and emotional well-being. Our discussion highlighted and linked the grandiose structure to the false self, the facade narcissistic individuals maintain to protect themselves from the vulnerability of being in a genuine, close, and loving relationship. Understanding these dynamics is essential as it allows for the development of deeper, more authentic, there's that word again, connections. In our next episode, we will continue our focus on how one can cultivate this authentic self, another concept championed by Donald Winnicott, who referred to this as, and I quote, the true self. So he had the false self, which we spoke about today, and then there's the true self, the more authentic side of the personality. We will explore practical strategies for fostering authenticity, emphasizing the significance of genuine emotional expressions and connection in overcoming the challenges posed by grandiosity. So, what aspects of the grandiose self-structure resonated with you the most? Okay, until next time, engage your mind and not your false, grandiose sense of self. All right, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.